Hey there everybody, this is Brad Guigar with another episode of Webcomics Confidential, and this is two-part of a multi-part series called 20 Questions. These are questions sent in to me from a young individual who's studying comics at university right now. And this person had questions on comics that I thought were universal enough that it was worth doing a video series that answered all of them, because I think these are questions that a lot of people have. And this question reads, if you were to take a hiatus on your comic, how long should or could it be, and how do you prepare your audience for it? This is a fantastic question because it shows old thinking in webcomics. And here's what I mean. There's a lot of people coming into webcomics today, and they saw how a lot of us were doing it back in the early 2000s and so forth. And so in kind of a cargo cult mentality, they try to mimic some of the things they see some of those older generation people doing. In some cases, that's a really good idea. In other cases, you have to understand why they were doing it to really implement it correctly. And this is an incorrect implementation, in my opinion, in my philosophy of webcomics publishing. This whole question shows that you're not thinking about the concept of hiatus correctly. And to do that, and to do that, you have to understand how publishing today works. And it's very different than publishing in 2005 worked. So the whole idea of a hiatus. Back in the day, before social media, we had to rely on people coming to our sites to read our comic on that site. Back then, that's when comic strips reigned supreme because they were daily. They could be updated on a regular beat. Boom, boom, boom. And you got people into the habit of coming to your website or establishing an RSS feed and reading your comic that way. If you were going to break that habit, then it was an important idea for you to announce a hiatus and say, hey, folks, I'm going to take a break for X number of days, X number of weeks. Publishing will pick up after that. The idea of a hiatus was born under those circumstances of a regularly scheduled production situation. Publishing today on the web has nothing to do with that. Again, I think I've used the example of a person who comes into a restaurant as being our webcomics consumer. In 2005, we had to hope that this person found our website and found our restaurant and walked into it. And then we could feed them the stuff that we were preparing. Today, our web consumer is sitting in front of a conveyor belt of a smorgasbord that's rolling food past them continually, and they're picking what they want out of that smorgasbord on the conveyor belt. And you have to have your food on the conveyor belt as it goes by if you hope to get that person to start liking and appreciating your food. Webcomics publishing is that conveyor belt smorgasbord, okay? And the only thing that you're going to accomplish in announcing a hiatus is bringing attention to the fact of a negative from the standpoint of your reader that there's been an interruption. You're calling attention to a negative in announcing a hiatus. Meanwhile, you can take as many hiatuses, is that correct? The plural of hiatus? Hiatuses? Hiatus? Anyway, you can have as many hiatus moments as you want by simply taking a hiatus and not saying anything, because your reader has so much stuff rolling in front of them, they're not even gonna notice. They're not gonna notice. They've got so much content coming through in front of them. You can take a week off and then pick right up the next week. They're not gonna know. They're not even going to notice. So this whole idea of announcing a hiatus, to me, is counterproductive. You're calling attention to a negative. Take your hiatus. Take your hiatus for as long as you want, as long as you need. As long as you come back and publish good quality comics on social media, on the web, you're going to pick right up where you left off. It's not the same publishing experience as those ideas that were formed when you were coming into this. Those are old ideas. That's publishing in 2005. Today, you are social media publishing, Okay, and we're going to come around to that idea in just a few moments because I think I took a little peek at your next question, and we're going to keep talking about this. So that's no better transition than to say question number 7. You talk a lot about how important social media and Patreon is, but it also takes up a lot of time. How much time do you set aside for this, and how do you balance it with creating comics? Well, as I told you, we're going to come right back to talk about this idea of social media publishing, okay? So again, back in 2005, or I guess closer, I guess the tipping point starts to come around 2007, 2008, towards 2010, when social media really picks up steam on the web publishing landscape. Social media was at first looked at as a way to promote your comic. You promoted it on social media and then sent them over to your website. That's gone. Now, social media is not, it's clearly also a promotional platform, but in as much as it's promotional, it is even more so a publishing platform. Again, all or mostly all of your readers are getting their content on social media. So social media is not so much promotion as it is publishing. They are getting their content from social media. They have to be able to read your comic unobstructed, not a link on Twitter to someplace else. They need to read it on social media. Okay? Social media is publishing. There and so let's put a button on that just for a second. Social media is publishing. Patreon is monetizing. We used to monetize back in the day with ads. Those days are gone. Now it's crowdfunding. Kickstarter, Patreon are the two biggies. You can also factor in Indiegogo and places like GoFundMe, but the two big ones are Kickstarter and Patreon. Now, Patreon, it is mentioned in your question, is monetization. We're not monetizing using advertising anymore. Now we're monetizing using Patreon. It's how you make money doing webcomics. Are you seeing where I'm going here? Well, that's like saying, hey, I had a lot of fun making this baby, but how do I find time feeding it? And gee whiz, I gotta let it out of the house every once in a while. You don't find time to do social media. You don't find time to do Patreon. That's called publishing a webcomic. You don't find time. You might as well ask me, how do you find time to ink? How do you find time to do pencils? How do you find time to write? You don't find time for social media. It's what you do if you want to publish a webcomic. In other words, it's part of the necessity of doing a webcomic. You can't just, in other words, you're saying that these are extraneous things, and they're not. They're not extraneous. They're part of the job. They're part of what you need to do if you want to do a webcomic. They're not, same as inking, same as writing, same as penciling. Social media is not extraneous. It's part of the process. And Patreon, when the time is right for Patreon and Kickstarter, will not be extraneous. It's part of the process. And I put that little caveat because once again, I looked ahead at your next question. So we're just going to go barreling right forward because it's going to lead right into what I'm going to say next. Question number 8. When do you know it's time to start a Patreon or a Kickstarter if you're new to it? Well, I got bad news for you. Well, it's not bad news. It's just the reality. If you're new to it, Patreon and Kickstarter is not for you. Stay away. You're not ready for it yet. If you're new to it, you have no business on Patreon or Kickstarter. Let's take them in order. Patreon. Patreon is not a place to build an audience. Patreon is a place to monetize a large audience once you've built it yourself, using those things we talk about on social media. Patreon is a place to monetize the audience that you've built. Until you've built an audience, you have no business being on Patreon. Simple as that. Stay away. It's not for you yet. It's a good goal to have. And by the way, that's not a put down. That's like saying to someone, how come you don't let me into the Olympics? I only just started running last week. Well, you've got to work up to that. You've got to work up to the Olympics. You've got to work up to this. If you just started, you have no place being on Patreon. Same thing with Kickstarter. Kickstarter has a lot better in terms of discovery than Patreon ever had, but you don't launch a Kickstarter until A, you have enough content that you can pull the trigger on a book, for example, right now. In other words, you've got that content done. It's ready to go, ready to send to the printer. All you need is the money to make that happen. And you've built your audience up enough that you have a pretty good indication that when you put this note out saying, hey, I've got a Kickstarter, that people are going to respond in a positive manner. Now, how do you, so let's get this out of the way right off the bat. If you're new to it, you don't belong there. Now, let's say you've been doing this for a while. Let's say you've been doing this for a while. Well, Patreon, you've got a pretty good way of knowing that. Once you start to build your audience up, you see that people are responding to your work, you're getting engagement on social media, this is starting to build, then you can start a Patreon and start it very small. Start it with a $2 support the comic level, stuff like that. If you can start to swing exclusive content, that's where the money is on Patreon, exclusive content. Kickstarter, meanwhile, let's say you've been doing this for a while. You have all the content ready for a new book. You're ready to pull the trigger. You have all those things that we just talked about in terms of social media and engagement. You put that Kickstarter up then. Once you judge your audience to be a pretty good size, you're getting really good engagement. Okay? You put that Kickstarter up. Now, you're going to hear the free market research speech. At that point, you're getting free market research. And you are going to find out whether you are ready for the market or conversely, if the market is ready for you. The answer might be no, and that's okay. That's a fair answer to get. It's not a failure. People look at this stuff like, oh, I failed. My Kickstarter failed. No. You got free market research. Back in the day, people spent thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on market research. You got yours for free. If your Kickstarter fails, it means that either you weren't ready for the market or the market wasn't ready for you. You take that information and you retool, you rebuild, you use that information to take your career to the next step. So there's nothing lost in a failed Kickstarter. There's lots to gain if you keep your head screwed on straight, and if you have the presence of mind to use that as a learning experience. You've got all kinds of opportunities there. But you gotta keep your mental game on straight, okay? Let's go on to the next question. Question number 9, where should you be financially before considering an assistant, a colorist, or a letterer? Well, financially, you should be to the point where you can pay an assistant, a colorist, or a letterer. I'm not sure I understand the question. If you are making enough money through your comic that you can afford these things, and you can afford to bring on a collaborator like that, then you're ready. If you don't have the money yet, you're not ready. Okay, you have to be able to pay for these things, and if you can't pay for them, you're not ready. I'm not sure I understand the question. If there's a nuance to that question that I'm missing, let me know. But this seems like a no-brainer. If you can afford to pay a collaborator, then and if you want or need those, like me, I need a colorist. I'm a horrible colorist. I needed to make that a priority. And as soon as I could afford to have a colorist, I brought one on. Believe me, and my work took a tremendous leap forward. But I couldn't do that before I could afford it. And let's bring us to our last question. How do you find a good editor? How do you determine that they're a good fit for you? Do you change editor when you write a new story? And how much does it cost to hire an editor? How do you find a good editor? There's lots of editors out there. They're all promoting their services on social media. All you need to do is start to get tapped into to comics Twitter, for example, or pay attention to what's going on Facebook and Instagram. And if you pay enough attention, you will find out that there are lots of people out there involved in these pursuits. You can also ask somebody for a recommendation. Everybody's always happy to recommend an editor if they've worked with a good one. Changing editors based on different stories, I don't see the purpose in that unless the subject matter is something that the editor wouldn't want to deal with. Then you might need to do that. How do you know they're a good fit? You can certainly ask for references, but you won't know until you get into it. And then if you get an editor that's a bad fit, then you take that as a life lesson and you move on. That's not the end of the world. And how much does it cost? That depends on the editor. I would absolutely not go into on this video telling you what I think rates should be, or using the rates that I've paid in the past and tell you that that's universal. I have absolutely no advice for you on that. That is something that's going to change from editor to editor, and you should expect it to be so. You should expect probably better editors who are doing more heavy lifting in that regard are probably going to cost a little bit more. In the same way, you'll probably find that somebody who's just doing the low-level check the spelling stuff are probably going to do it pretty inexpensively. And the more you're asking from your editor, for example, if you're asking for story advice or plot development, that sort of thing, you should be prepared to pay more. But I'm not going to give you a dollar amount because that would be unfair to all the editors out there. So that brings us to the end of this segment of Webcomics Confidential. A lot of crowdfunding, a lot of social media, a lot of important questions asked there. I love these questions. If you have a question that you'd like to add to our list, we're not going to stop at 20. We're going to have more questions coming down the pike. So if you'd like to add your question, hit the comments below. Let me know what your question is. In the meantime, thank you so much for sending these questions in. I think these are questions everybody has, and I think it's a pretty universal thing. So I think this is going to be a useful series. This is Brad Guigar once again for Webcomics Confidential, and I'll see you next time.